Well, as I was saying, Marshall will be here in a minute. We're going to split these duties up. I'm going to set us up today for slavery in French Saint-Domingue and get us to the point of revolution there. He'll do the revolutionary part, and then I will take a few minutes at the end to talk about some of the characters of the Haitian slave revolt that I've been working on. This is Giorgio Sioux, who was the most important leader after Boukman Duffy was killed 3 months into the revolution, and he leads it. We know more about Toussaint LOuverture, but I'll explain that later. And so that's the way the script goes today. I'll be the bookends. So, have any of you been to Haiti or the Dominican Republic? Okay, good. I've never been on the Haitian side. I was raised in the Dominican Republic, so I knew, the Spanish history, but I did not know much about the other side. So that has come to me as I study in graduate school and so on. But at one point, of course, it was all one island called Hispaniola by the Spaniards, who claim it after Columbus first describes it in 1492. And it became the center of the Spanish government in the Caribbean before the big hits of Mexico and later Peru that you may have studied about as well. So the heartland of the Caribbean is Hispaniola, where we're working today, and it will later be divided between the Spanish and the French. But at the beginning, it's Spanish. So much of what we learned last time about Spanish ideas about race and so on, and slavery would be applicable here, and so keep that in mind. And so here was our agenda for the program, and we're on April 11th, so this is what we're doing today. And here's some of the big picture meanings of Haiti, and of course Marshall's the big picture guy, and I tend to be down in the minutia. But this is the first successful war for independence in all of Latin America, and it becomes the first free black republic in the whole Western Hemisphere. And as such, it has a tremendous ripple effect throughout really the whole Western Hemisphere, at least. It's the bloodiest of all the struggles as well, and had the worst aftermath, so some of those problems are with us still today. It was a social revolution, not just a political revolution such as ours. And it was very, racially divided, polarizing for obvious reasons. Tremendous horror on both sides, black against white and white against black. Very, very bloody. And the famous quote that Simón Bolívar had about, when you start a revolution, it's like riding a tiger. You can't fall off, you better not. So those are sort of the big view. Yes, sir?
There have been people who have said that this affected the feeling of the French government so much that if this had not happened and they had peace in Haiti, they would not have sold us the Louisiana Purchase.
That's right.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, that's one of the after effects. This Napoleon's big plan for the hemisphere is pretty well ruined by the waste of this revolution and the waste of lives and money, and his big grand design is given up at that point, yes. So that's one of the big after effects. And we'll show you a little slide about that. So just to orient us a little bit, sitting dead in the center there, we have the Dominican Republic and Haiti from a modern perspective. But you can sort of see how its central location and its very important racial dimensions made it a very important event in all of that world. And everybody tried to contain this revolution, to isolate it and embargo it, including our U.S. government. And it took many years before finally they were recognized, and it cost them a great deal to get that recognition. This is an older map. Here comes Marshall, so I cued us already. An older map of the 18th century. You can see that what does become the Haitian side, the French side, is only a third of the island. And the rest the Spanish clung to, although they didn't have really many settlements all over there, so that's sort of a false claim in itself. But the way it happened was that Santo Domingo on the southern coast was the Spanish headquarters. They had started 2 little settlements up on the north, the Spanish did. First, Fort Navidad, you may have read about, that Columbus's ship wrecked on the reefs, and he had to leave 39 men behind as he went home to report that he had claimed the New World for Spain. And so when he comes back the next year, those men have been slaughtered. one of the weirdly interesting things I'll just throw in that I found when they came back was the Taino Indians had removed everybody's eyes, and I always wondered what that was about, what the significance of eyes were as they scattered them. Anyway, Columbus comes back. That's obviously an unlucky site, so they start a new settlement at La Isabela on the northern coast, which is in today's Haiti. And there's been wonderful archaeology done there by my mentor, Kathleen Deegan, who does all that National Geographic Columbus site archaeology. And so that was also considered unlucky, and they end up moving down to Santo Domingo on the southern coast, becomes the headquarters for everything. Well, if you're way down here at the bottom, and the rest of the Caribbean's above you, and it's fairly vacant, the French buccaneers you may have heard of from Tortuga on the northern coast, a little island that became sort of the pirates' den of the Caribbean. Buccaneers referred to the bouquin where they dried meat and so on, and these are sort of desperate men left behind that lived in the wild and had wild dogs and shot cattle, and then would sell their hides to all of the passing ships and so on. And eventually there are enough of them that France from Tortuga claims that they are occupying the north, and there has to be a treaty, eventually the Treaty of Ryswick, to settle it in 1697. Well, the Spanish couldn't hold, what they had, so they can't really do much about that. And so that western side becomes French. Okay. Well, what the French want to do with it eventually is produce sugar there, and that's what they end up doing. And every time there's sugar, there's African slaves, and it's misery. So it's going to be a very horrible development of a very profitable sugar regime there very quickly, and that little third of an island becomes the most valuable piece of property that the French Empire controls. So that is like 40% of their income on that little third of an island, and it's tremendously important. So it's a sugar colony par excellence, and they called it the Pearl of the Antilles, the French did, because of the great wealth that came out of there. So the golden age sort of that French side is 1763 to 91, so a pretty interesting time period. 8,000 plantations, always sugar on the northern plain, and on the bottom, on the south there, on the that little piece that sticks out to the west there, we had coffee and indigo plantations as well. Some cotton, but more indigo. Indigo was really the more profitable. So this little place, 2/3 of all the French tropical products and 1/3 of all of its foreign trade out of that much land. And in all cases, it's African slaves that work it. Okay, it was less gruesome to work on the bottom part where it's indigo and rice. I mean, indigo and cotton. That's less harsh, but in sugar, you don't want to be. All right, so we're conducting trade with both sides of that island, as a matter of fact. But what I wanted to mention was that the social patterns in this new world are sort of a blend of what we've talked about. So many of the people had already been acquainted with Spanish parts of the island, but they are also French. The pattern was sort of absentee planter owners from France who would come here, create families, mixed-race families, leave their mixed-race children in charge of those plantations and go home. And so people of color became pretty profitable in the southern and western parts in indigo and coffee and some of the lesser products. And some of those children had the fortune to go back to Paris and be educated and create an intellectual circle of their own of property owners who held slaves, who held newly imported, purely African slaves. And so that relationship is somewhat like what we've talked about in Spanish America, where there were free people of color owning slaves and managing plantations. We don't know what those interpersonal relationships were like, for, any more than we did in the Spanish world, but it does exist. So these intermediate groups of propertied and many times educated free people of color, gens de couleur, have a very awkward position in between the white elites in France that they would like to be and the masses of slaves that they want to distance themselves from, who are at the bottom. Okay. I can't remember our slideshow, so I better move, see if we've missed something. Oh, there, I just put a modern slide in there also to see a little bit bigger some of the areas that we're talking about today. So you can see where the earthquake happened. Port-au-Prince is on the bottom. That's where the cotton and sugar and indigo, cotton and coffee and indigo was on the bottom. On the northern plain, that didn't happen. The earthquake was not so severe there. What happened there is the total destruction of the revolution. All right, so here's our reminders where I should be. 1492, Columbus, the French buccaneers. We did talk about occupying the western side, and finally the treaty that gives it to the French. In the meantime, the French had passed something called the Code Noir. We've talked about some of the other legal systems, the English chattel slave system and the Spanish system based on Roman law, the Siete Partidas that talked about people as people and slavery as an accidental condition, and one that was permeable in and out, and one that was not race-based. Those are the big lessons to take away on that. So there we have the treaty that finally gives them the western half. The Code Noir is like sort of in between. It does have some provisions for the care of slaves, that you have to provide an annual set of clothing, and that some provisions about limitations on punishments and those kinds of things. But it's not as liberal as the Roman system the Spanish had. And again, law does not equal reality anywhere, so just be aware of that. But you can manipulate it to some degree. And the most successful manipulation of law by people of color was through the Spanish system, which will explain some of the outcomes that we're going to talk about at the end, about why people would choose one side over the other. Okay? And then we talked about the major plantation system. All right, well, this is a very early image about a sugar mill, and it just shows you some of the labor that's involved. This was in Hispaniola in the 16th century, where they first start sugar after they bring it through the Mediterranean world out to the Atlantic Islands. To Hispaniola is the first sugar complex. And at that point, we do have some censuses from the 1540s that show a large group of Indians also working in sugar, still alive after we think everybody's wiped out immediately. Many Indians still surviving on these plantations and working with many, many Africans. And there were like 5 major big state-owned operations in Hispaniola. I was shocked to find 700, 800 slaves on a plantation. You know, in the antebellum South that we're always saying we're not doing here, 100 slaves is considered a large plantation, but 700 or 800, because these were state operations with a lot of investment. And I have one student working on Indian slavery in Hispaniola and the Circum-Caribbean right now, and I had a former student that helped me, or she found those censuses. And I always wanted somebody to say, what's the relationship? Look at what they're doing in those plantations. Are they living together? Are they forming families? Are they doing different kinds of labor? Are there specialties assigned to certain African ethnicities versus others? You know, so somebody still needs to do that, but it is an interesting proposition. Well, so you see, you have to plant this cane, you have to cut this cane, we've seen it before, you have to haul it into the place, you have to then squeeze it through the grinders, you have to boil it, you have to find out exactly when to, you know, quit boiling it and put it in those little shapers. And so this showed an early image, but a lot of different kinds of labor involved in sugar production, and not easy. So here's our golden age and our 8,000 plantations and our plantations of sugar in the northern part. And so then when we're leading up, getting closer to this revolutionary period, 40,000 whites, 30,000 of those intermediary people of color, and about 500,000 slaves. So you can see where the actual force is in this if you do it in terms of population. And the most interesting thing about the African population is that, you know, now we have this wonderful transatlantic slave trade database that the English fellows put together, and we keep adding to it. It was very heavily loaded towards 18th century English at the beginning, because they had the Lloyds of London records on insurance and insuring boats and cargoes and stuff, and that's where it started. But slowly people have been adding earlier pieces from other language groups and so on. And what we find is that the people that were pouring in to run this sugar plantation operation are basically from Congo, Angola, the Central African peoples, who had had Catholicism there since the 1500s and had some urban populations, who had had long exchange with the Portuguese government, letters from the African kings to the King of Portugal, and exchanges of educated elites and that sort of thing. Jesuits and Capuchins and all sorts of missionary groups had gone through there, and we have a tremendous amount of paper trail, actually, from very early on about Congo, Angola, and also some very good anthropology and ethnohistory of the Congo, Angola people. Wyatt McGaffey is one of the really interesting scholars, I think, who studies the Congo, Angola people. And they had somewhat, as we always try to say when we show you that big African map, very different ideas than somebody from Senegambia or somebody from Benin. You know, we're way down in Congo, Angola now with ideas of a circle of life, recycling of life, and the upper half is when you're alive, the bottom half is when you're dead, but you're going to come around again, and you may be your grandmother when you come around again, but you're coming. And so Judith brought me some great stuff from the Sea Islands. We'll go back at the end to talk about some of the interesting ideas that maybe you'd like to do more with as we race through this. But the Congo people and Angola people left a big imprint on the Gullah Coast. Yes, sir?
The 30,000 people of color, were they on the island before Columbus? They're indigenous?
No, I'm sorry. That's the gens de couleur category that I was talking about that have a French father and an African mother.
Was there any indigenous people there?
There probably were, but they're almost non-existent at this point. And everybody used to say that Taino were wiped away, but in the earlier period I showed you about, they still weren't gone, and there are still recurring wars. And what happens is most everybody goes running to the mountains to hide out and to escape. The ones that didn't die of disease, overwork, or rebellion are up in the mountains, often with runaway slaves, and they're called maroons. Remember the cimarron word that we talked about? So up in the mountains are many, many maroon communities, and there is a mountainous chain. If I went back to that map, I don't trust myself to get back. Oops. There is a Cordillera Central, is that mountainous chain right down the middle. So it gets runaways from both sides, and later I'll find runaways from the French side coming over those mountains and getting to Saint-Domingue and claiming that same religious sanctuary that I talked about the other day when people ran from Carolina down to Florida. And this was strange to me to find that, because the French are Catholic too, you know. So, and I thought, well, the Spanish will just send them back because, you know, they're part of the joint compact and all of that, and they're both Catholics. And no, they kept them, and they made a free black town on the other side of the Ozama River of Santo Domingo too, that was called San Lorenzo de los Negros de Mina. And so they're like my Mose, where I saw who was the captain, who was the sergeant, who were the people. We have lists for that little town too. And they became a black militia, and their titles are like Captain So-and-so. It's not all Mina people, it's a mix again of people. But so that sanctuary actually happens across those mountains too. But many of the people, especially I imagine the ones that had just gotten off the boat from Congo, Angola, might have stayed up in those mountains anyway and not gone to the city and asked for political asylum. To back up to your idea, there are Indians, and they're up there in the hills somewhere, but they're not part of this complex usually. Very few survive, but those that did hid. Yes, ma'am?
Looking at the huge proportion of slaves compared to everybody else, were there a lot of overseers, or how did they maintain control over?
That's a great question, and terror is one of the ways, and real horrible punishments is another way. And they did have overseers, and they have black overseers often. And so this relationship, whether it's antebellum South or it's Saint-Domingue, is a very interesting and difficult one. Those poor people that get chosen to be the middlemen there may in some way be protecting people you know, in the slave quarters, and may in some ways have to punish them too to keep the equilibrium. So one of the things that happens to release that pressure is that people run to the mountains. So marronage is a big constant in this history. I know that you all have very many interests, and I hope you'll look at the trilogy written by Madison Smart Bell, who is a Vanderbilt graduate, and Dad was on the board of trust, I think, and wonderful work on all of this period of Saint-Domingue. And he's we've had him, he's a great speaker if you ever have a chance to see him, and does Haitian Creole, and he supports the arts in Haiti, and a wonderful writer, and so on. So your question is, how do we maintain control? There are constant rebellions as well, and so every once in a while you'll see a famous one crush. So one of the most famous precursors to the revolution is that revolt of Macandal, who was, their literature works about him as well. He was armless because his arm had gotten in one of those grinders, which happens often. And he was said to be, and reputed to be by the slaves, a healer, a magician of sorts, you know, and could have been. And he is captured after a long period of marronage. And in all of these slave systems, you can't possibly hit everybody all the time. But when you have somebody big and important, you make a show out of it, and you make public terror to keep the others in line. And so Macandal's execution is one of those moments of theater, of horror. And they tie him to a stake, and they make all the slaves come out and watch any of these executions, of course. And they burn him at the stake. And he is so strong that even with one arm he broke free, and they have to pull him back. And the way the Haitians saw it, he escapes by turning into a bug and flying away. So maybe he did. And so there are a series of those. He's the most famous, and so the pressure's always there, the tension's always there, and it's every once in a while you have to do something like that. One of the things the planters feared all the time was slave revolt. And then they also feared slaves in their household, poisonings. And then they also, and Macandal was supposed to be a poisoner as well. And they feared the cane fields always burning up. Another wonderful work on this whole episode is by another great scholar that we've had here a number of times, Laurent Dubois, and he has Avengers of the New World, and that's from a quote, "We will be the Avengers of the New World." And it's a wonderful read, so that's a good one too. So is that where we were? Okay. And to make my point about the Angola wave coming in, this is an illustration I found. There's a wonderful database of slave imagery, if you ever want to find some neat images for a talk or something, by Jerome Handler, Handler, and you can just Google slave images database and find these wonderful things. And this is an actual French ship coming from Angola, the Marie Seraphique, and she's arriving in Le Cap at the northern coast, which is where all this happens in the 1770s. And I don't know, it's sort of small to see, but you can see the slaves are all on the back part of the boat. In the front, people come out and they sort of have tea and they discuss sales and so on, and you know, they're rowing in and out. And then Le Cap itself, when I was writing this book, I wanted to think about, visualize what was this city like, and I started reading accounts, travel accounts and others about what was in the city and so on. And remember, Pearl of the Antilles, hugely wealthy place, ships coming from everywhere into this place, and it's a huge marketplace of ideas and material goods. And one of the things, this is a woman of a Jean de couleur with her servants behind her coming down to get to the linen market in Le Cap and buy some fancy linens. But they describe the houses with aviaries and little mini zoos and beautiful gardens. And if you look at some of the imagery, there's fountains everywhere. The Jesuit convent was a whole block long, huge churches, Catholic cathedrals, a theater, a very active theater, beautiful looking city, well-equipped city. And so those slaves that are up in the northern plantations, like my Biassou, can, with a half-hour walk, come down and see all of this. There were newspapers, there were philosophic groups. It was a very cultured and interesting place. And And then there are places that are poor that don't have the streets and so on, and where all the taverns and the lowlifes hang out, and they called some of that Angola, you know. So it was an interesting mix, and sailors getting off the boat from everywhere, and you know, so think of a very international place. And now we're coming to Marshall and the French Revolution, and then I'll hop back up in a minute. Yeah. Oh yeah, you got to get this on. That's what you do.
Tell them about your...
No. Oh, yes, yes. No, somebody else did. Yes, sir.
You started a little thing about the Taínos taking out the people with the Spanish scribes' eyes, and then you talked about I know you're coming back, but I could just...
Yeah, well, we could talk, but it wasn't about this topic, but it just was so weird that I always wondered, you know, and a lot of the articles we find have eye references to it, and I think a lot of cultures believe you can see into the future and the past, and maybe. I mean, you know, nobody said anything about it, but I yeah, maybe. But you know, yes, like those, exactly, and then Easter Island, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, but why they left everything carefully staged like that, I don't know.
Well, we still don't know.
All right, see if I can keep the microphone on. Okay, so we're doing tag team. It's like touch. And world wrestling here. All right, so what Jane's described is the French developed this incredibly wealthy colony built on the labor of hundreds of thousands of Africans who were enslaved. And it has to be a system built on fear, right? I mean, what I'm about to describe is the ultimate nightmare of the planter class, right? You live in societies where the overwhelming majority of the population are people who you have enslaved, and you're in the tiny minority. So always, at least in the back of your mind, if not closer, is what's going to happen if these people rise up. What I'm about to describe is that nightmare. The Haitian Revolution is the largest and most successful slave revolt in the history of the Americas, by far. Okay. Part of what you're doing is keeping people in their place by theatrical terror, right? Part of it's day-to-day brutalizing people, so that after a while you understand, you think long and hard about resisting, running away. But in a place like Haiti, you see on a regular basis people are challenging the system and running away. But the key sort of question, there's a famous book, maybe more than 40 years ago now, called Why Men Rebel. I guess women don't. But the real question is not why people rebel, is why they don't, right? I mean, look at a place like Syria or Libya or the whole Arab Spring. You know, for decades and decades, people said, no, nothing's going to change. And suddenly something happens, and there's this transformation, and hundreds of thousands of people go out in the street. So in a place like Haiti, what you've got is, or Saint-Domingue at this point, is all of these people living in this incredibly oppressive, brutal system. And in this case, it does blow up. And part of this is very specifically triggered by another revolution in France. So when the French Revolution breaks out in 1789, they storm the Bastille, and eventually they kill the king, right? This unleashes this fundamental transformation in Western history, right? Our modern political spectrum, even the terms we use, leftist and rightist, come from the French Revolution, right? This transforms the Western world. So when this breaks out, you get the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Again, I guess women don't have rights. Men are born free and remain free and equal in rights, which is an incredibly radical idea, especially in the 18th century in places that are, for several thousand years, have been built on monarchy, hierarchy, inequality. And so you get this whole process that begins in 1789, and over the next decade, most people study the French Revolution. It's sort of 1789 to 99 is the period of great upheaval. Then Napoleon emerges, and then you get the Napoleonic era, right? So for the next roughly 15 years, Napoleon and his armies will storm all over Europe. So part of what happens here is at the level of who controls the empire, there's a crisis. You kill the king, authority evaporates, so out in the colonies, the same sort of crisis of authority takes place. So part of what provides the opportunity for this massive rebellion is a crisis at what I would call the elite level. Here's Marshall's theory of revolution. The people rise up against oppression all the time and almost always are beaten down. Right? Sometimes you have crises at the level of a state authority, and authority is in question or collapses. When both of those things happen simultaneously, you get revolution. Right? Because now those forces that would have beaten down those people rising up have evaporated. So it gives them the opportunity. So my theory of revolution is you've got to have both these things happen at the same time. You have to have a powerful challenge from below, but up above they have to be weak. This is what happens in France. This is what happens in Mexico in 1910. This is what happens in Russia in 1917. Crisis at both levels. So you have these profound divisions, and with it, what Jane was showing is that what you also have is these deeply rooted divisions on the island, on the western one-third of the island. You have several 100,000 slaves, primarily born in Africa and who have arrived. Right? And then you've got these whites who are in control, and then you have these people in the middle who are racially mixed, who are free, often of high economic status, but are always chafing that the whites do not, this is never going to stay on me, that the whites are never going to treat them the way they expect. So there is a tension not only between slaves and free, but between those people of color who are free and those who are white. So this elite division opens up the possibility. Now let me, the disclaimer here. Both the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolutions are incredibly complicated, go back and forth. Haiti's even more complicated than France. So I'm not going to go through the ups and downs. I'm going to sort of just give you the big picture here. It is astonishing the way things move back and forth between 1791 and 1804 in Haiti. Incredible. They're invaded by the French, the Spanish, the English multiple times. They're fighting among themselves. There are divisions among the slaves that rise up. There are divisions among the free enslaved people. It's an incredible process, but it's clearly France that triggers this, and in particular those people of color on the island of on the colony of Saint-Domingue say, Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, we are free and equal. So in a sense what begins is a challenge by those people in the middle to the whites saying, all right, the revolution has begun in France, you must now treat us as equals. And so these images of blacks wanting to have Lady Liberty and freedom are very powerful, especially these people of color. And Saint-Domingue will send black delegates over. And there's all these disputes. Do we accept these delegates from Saint-Domingue to sit in the National Assembly? So within the French Revolution itself, they're having an argument over, when we said free and equal, do we mean people of all color? So the real radicals are going, yes, it's everybody. And the other people go, well, no, not really everybody. It's just people like us. So Saint-Domingue actually, and delegates from Saint-Domingue actually go to France and are a part of this upheaval. And of course, as they come back to the island, they're going to the whites, all right, it's time. So there's this two-level crisis that's going on between free people of color and the whites, and then ultimately between the slaves and the people who are free. One of the things that distinguishes Haiti still is the emergence of this new religion, Vodun. Right? Vodun has its roots in African religions, but it is truly an American religion. Right? It is something which begins, evolves, and develops its own logic here in the Americas, just like Candomblé in Brazil or Santeria in Cuba. And the person who is associated with the outbreak of the slave uprising, Boukman, is actually known as one of these sort of priests of Vodun. So from the very beginning, the revolt itself is associated with this Afro-American religion. Without going into the complicated details, as those free people of color challenge the whites, the slaves can start to see there's a crisis. Right? So they start to begin to challenge the system. And a number of powerful slave charismatic figures gather together in 1791 and plan an uprising and a revolt. Right? So basically what's going to happen is Boukman is the initial leader of this. It begins on that northern plain. Right? So as Jane said, the southern section and the southwestern section is a very different. So this is the region that is heavily Congo-Angola slaves. So part of what's going on here is also lots of people who have not lived their entire lives in slavery They have been enslaved in Africa, brought across the Atlantic, and are no doubt trying to figure out how to get out of the system of slavery. So these are not people who have had generation after generations of slavery. In the end, this uprising breaks out in 1791. This is an incredibly brutal, bloody conflict. The Madison Smart Bell trilogy, incredible novels. The guy's an incredible novelist. He won the Pulitzer Prize for All Souls Rising, didn't he? Or maybe it was the National Book Award. This All Souls Rising is the first in this trilogy about the Haitian Revolt. He writes beautifully. I got about halfway through and finally went, you know, I don't think I'm going to read on. This is too brutal for me because it is so realistic. Right? I mean, this is ultimately the slave class's nightmare. What happens when your slaves rise up? They literally, savagely, brutally kill you. Right? Take control of the plantations, burn them. So this is a war of no quarter on all sides. As the English and eventually the Spanish and the French come in, they will be equally brutal because they are worried what happens if this revolt on this tiny little place spreads to our other colonies. What if it spreads to Cuba, Jamaica, the U.S. South? So all the planter class in the Americas is watching this going, they must put this down. Right? So it's an incredibly brutal process. Tens of thousands of European troops by various powers at different times are brought in to try and stop this. The death rates of the Europeans is enormously high because they're dying from yellow fever and malaria. Right? So it's oftentimes is a death sentence for the foreign troops, not because of the battle, but because of the environment. In June of 1793, the French revolutionary regime will abolish slavery. So what you also have on the island is a dispute among those planters who stay and try and hang on to the system, who are French, and their own revolutionary regime. So in this sense, the Haitian Revolt is an international conflict in its broadest sense between France and the colony, and with all these other planters from English, Dutch, Spanish planter societies around there trying to say, we must contain this. We have to stop it. And the fighting does spread to some of the other islands, but never on this kind of scale. The most famous figure to emerge out of this is Toussaint LOuverture, who is a fascinating guy. Anybody ever been to the Toussaint LOuverture Cemetery? You ever been down Hillsborough Road? Corner of Del Rio Pike? Right there. There's a cemetery. It's actually two cemeteries. The old black cemetery and the white cemetery. And there's actually a historical marker on it. It was called the Toussaint LOuverture Cemetery. It's very interesting. I stumbled across this one day. And I asked all sorts of people around here, you ever heard of this? No, I've never heard of this. All right? So he becomes this incredible figure. He's born on the island. He is initially a slave, and he rises in the ranks to be a steward, right? One of these very important figures. He is probably fluent in multiple languages. He is sort of like a veterinarian. Right? He's somebody who has sort of learned through experience to work with animals. So he has this sort of ability to work with horses and other animals, so that gives him an important value. He's literate in French. There's a long debate over to what extent he's really Catholic or not, but he's certainly conversant with Catholicism. And there's a huge debate over to what extent he practices Vodun. But he's one of Jane's Atlantic Creoles here, right? He is incredibly plastic in the sense of his ability to deal probably with different types of Africans, with Creoles, with people of color, and with the planter class. So this is not some poor slave cutting cane. This is somebody who emerges and is really important and is eventually freed by his owner. Okay? So this is somebody who is a very privileged person who's emerged out of slavery because of his intelligence, his leadership, and his abilities. And he takes on this name, right? L'Ouverture, right? The opening. So rather than go through all the ups and downs of the Haitian Revolt, let's just say from 1791 to 1804, it's incredibly bloody, multiple invasions, the island split up, there are multiple factions. Sometimes those factions are split between blacks and mulattoes fighting each other. Some of the bloodiest fighting, the most brutal massacres are between mulatto troops and black troops fighting for power and their leaders. Eventually, Toussaint will emerge as the most powerful of these figures. When I finish talking, Jane's going to come back. She's actually going to tell you about one of these guys who is one of the most important figures initially and who ends up outside of Haiti. So what he will do is eventually gather more and more of these people who are sort of his lieutenants under his command and gradually asserts control over the different fighting forces. The French, it's interesting, he doesn't want independence. Right? He wants autonomy. So he remains very loyal for most of this to staying part of France, but not as a colony. And eventually, after years of fighting, right, that incredibly rich colony, right, you're not exporting anything. You're not generating revenue. You're not feeding people. Plantations are in disarray. So once he consolidates enough control, he reimposes a plantation system and a system of forced labor, which doesn't make him real popular. In 1801, he has himself declared governor for life. Governor, right? Not emperor, not president. They will invade the eastern two-thirds of the island. There is no love lost between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, right? And it goes way back. And for most of the first half of the 19th century, the Dominican Republic, what today is under Haitian control. Right? This goes back and forth from 1801 until about 1844. So the eastern two-thirds of the island, which is under Spanish control, Spanish-speaking, another slave plantation society, that's deeply embroiled in the revolt and the upheaval. The French, right, under Napoleon, are finally going, oh, we got enough problems in Europe. We're trying to fight the British and conquer Europe. So France tends to go back and forth. But in 1801, they will basically temporarily make their peace for the British and then start to focus on other issues. And in particular, they'll start to focus on Saint-Domingue again. So Napoleon will send his brother-in-law, Leclerc, into Saint-Domingue with new French troops to reconquer the island, right, and yet the next wave of this war. Thousands of French troops, most of whom die of yellow fever, including Leclerc. But in this process, the French finally decide they can't militarily defeat Toussaint, so they make peace overtures, and they invite him over for dinner. And when he shows up, they imprison him. And they ship him off to France, where he will die in prison. And this is somebody who has he has a number of children, all highly educated. Some of them have been sent to France for their own education. So Toussaint ultimately is betrayed by the French and ends up being taken out of the picture and dying in Europe. So Toussaint is this towering figure of the French revolt, of the Haitian slave revolt, who emerges as the great leader. Boukman is killed very quickly. There are a whole series of other powerful figures like Giorgio Sioux, but Toussaint is the sort of the emblem of this. There are only a few of these drawings of who he is. We're not really sure to what extent these are really accurate, but he is the sort of classic figure. This is an etching of the French arriving. This is incredibly brutal on all sides by all people of all shapes, sizes, and colors. And so for the planter class across the Americas, this is the kind of thing they don't want to see. They're looking at this and thinking, this could be South Carolina, this could be Jamaica, this could be northeastern coast of Brazil. So there's plenty of people writing about this. And much of that those French planters who survive and flee the island resettle. Some of them go to places like Cuba, some go to places like Charleston, right? And you can imagine the stories they're telling those Charleston planters and those Jamaican planters. And part of the end result of the Haitian Revolt is the hardening of the slave society in the U.S. South, right? It becomes increasingly difficult after 1800 in the U.S. South to free your slaves, even if you want to. The system of punishment increases, right? The rigidity of the system increases as a direct result of the Haitian Revolt. So there are lessons here for all those other planters. We will not let this happen in our place. There are a whole series of these powerful figures that emerged out of the slave revolt. Some of them were free, some of them were slave. The most important ones who survived briefly Dessalines is the one who actually, after the end of Toussaint, declares himself head of state. And so it's Dessalines who on January 1st, 1804, will declare the independence of this country. It will no longer be Saint-Domingue, right, Santo Domingo. And they take the name Haiti, which is from an Indian word, which means land of the mountains. That's an interesting thing. They actually take an indigenous word to describe this. So this is the first black republic in the Americas, in the world, I guess. So Haiti's independence is normally dated from January 1st, 1804. And in particular, in the aftermath of this, the interest of many of these planter classes is to isolate these guys as much as possible. Literally contain them, isolate them, shun them. So this is a country, when it becomes independent in 1804, that's gone through almost 15 years of incredibly brutal civil war, multiple foreign invasions, incredible bloodshed. The few whites, there are still whites left on the island, some of whom, actually, some of the best accounts we have are, there's a white doctor who goes around with Toussaint. He's like his lieutenant. Probably a third of all those 400,000 slaves die in the revolt itself. Right? So it's an incredibly brutal and bloody conflict. The United States is affected very specifically by this, because in this global rivalry between the English, the Spanish, and the French, Napoleon, when he sees this is not working in Haiti, right, pulls back. He's got to now fight the British. So as a part of this, he will sell Louisiana to the United States. So this huge chunk of territory, right, which expands, it doubles the size of the United States practically, right? Its sale to the United States is a direct result of this conflict over Haiti, right? And this is also part of what makes New Orleans so interesting, right? It's Spanish, it's French, then it's English, then it's American. So this is a direct outcome of this, is Napoleon pulls back from the Caribbean and focuses more on Europe. All right, I'm going to segue back to Jane here. Part of what's going on here is we talk about black diasporas in the Americas, right? Then there are diasporas within diasporas, right? So some of the people who leave this island, these African Americans, right, they leave Haiti and go to other places in the Americas. So Jane, I was going to tell you in particular about one she knows really well. Tag team. You're it. Sure.
You mentioned Europeans coming down with yellow fever and
Malaria.
Thank you. Were the natives developed an
Thanks.
No.
for those diseases?
Can you guys hear okay? So basically the yellow fever and malaria are brought by mosquitoes from Africa on slave ships, most likely. So part of the initial demographic catastrophe that destroys possibly 90% of Native American populations between 1492 and 1550 is European diseases. Some of those diseases are yellow fever, malaria, smallpox, influenza, simple stuff, but Native American populations have no immunity, no exposure. European and African populations still die from these things, but they have been with them for thousands of years, so they have levels of immunity. So part of bringing in African slaves is because you believe, and there's a certain biological logic to it, that Africans are tougher and can survive. So part of having all those African slaves is they come out of a place where yellow fever and malaria, these things have been endemic for a long time. You bring all these French troops in, they have not had experience with this. And this is the same thing happens when we try to build the Panama Canal. We go down and start trying to build, the French try to build the Panama Canal in the 1870s and 1880s, and they literally die off. When the Americans come in 1903, Army physicians go, it's mosquitoes, right? We figured this out in Cuba because the Cubans figured it out. It's the vectors, mosquitoes, get rid of the mosquitoes, you get rid of the yellow fever, malaria. So what does the U.S. Army does? It eliminates breeding grounds for mosquitoes in the canal zone, and eliminates the threat of yellow fever and malaria. These guys don't have they have quinine for malaria, and they know there's a relationship, right, but they don't understand it very well. So fault.
Okay. Thanks, Marshall. Is this on? Okay, you can hear me? Okay, good. Well, as Marshall mentioned, we had on our points there, Boukman is the person that launched the first slave revolt. There was a very, we're not sure how accurate the accounts are of a ceremony at a place called Bois de Camin, the crocodile forests, basically. And the drivers and people who had a lot of liberty to wander around on especially Sundays and feast days. Remember when we said these groups usually had opportunities to work for themselves or to get together for drumming and parties and so on. This is one of those kinds of ceremonies, and at that ceremony was this fellow, Giorgio Sioux, who was one of the big leaders of, oh, there he is up there, of the revolution. Boukman is the huge 6'4", sometimes people say, leader of the revolution, who also was attributed with healing powers and magical powers. And he leads it with this oath, this blood oath, in which they supposedly slaughter a pig, and everybody there vows to take on the revolution, and off they go. Well, Boukman's killed 3 months in. So the next person who takes charge of the revolution is this man, Giorgio Sioux. And so the reason I came across him was St. Augustine again. Remember where I did my dissertation? Lo and behold, he ends up dying in St. Augustine at the end of all of this aftermath. So I came across some of these little documents and I started tracking him. And eventually he became a character in my latest book. I tried to do a chapter on each revolution through someone from below who I could find records on. And so I looked a lot for documents in which his voice comes out. And I'll say one thing. I am the chief of the counter-revolution. I began the war almost without arms, without munitions, without supplies, and almost without resources on August 23rd, 1791, at a time that will always be remembered among the most magnificent of the universe. So he has a very grand sense of himself. And at first I thought, oh, you know, this is a little odd because I had never heard of him and most people had not. But as it turns out, as I did more and more of the history, he was the person that succeeded Boukman Daffy. And he will lead the troops for the first several years that Marshall talked about. There are other very important people also in these many armies, but he at one time had an army of 40,000 people that he's having to manage and supply and so on. So he was an important leader. Another one that will come up and rise in the ranks is one named Francois. And Toussaint hangs back for a while. He wants to see which way the winds are going before he jumps in. And he's free anyway, and he's privileged, as Marshall said. He waits. And when he comes in under Biassou as his surgeon for the army, since he was a veterinarian before. And so as I began researching those connections, I found they knew each other from the Haute du Cap, which is the high hills above Le Cap. And there were plantations up on that northern plain. And I started thinking about, what do you see in this region? You know, the Pearl of the Antilles I just described. It was only a 40-minute walk down from those plantations to this beautiful place with all the ships and the slavery and the markets and whatever. So Toussaint and Biassou apparently had known each other from childhood, from some of the letters that I have. Toussaint addresses him as my dear friend, and they talk about their former lives. So Biassou was probably a sugar chemist on one of these plantations, Toussaint a veterinarian, so obviously they're somewhat in a leadership position anyway. And George ends up taking on the command when Boukman is killed. And so in some of these letters, I find also references to this other third in the triad of powerful leaders, Jean-Francois, who was mulatto, and Toussaint and Biassou are saying, oh, he's just a dandy. All he wants to do is ride around in the carriages with the women. That's what, and they just don't know what they're going to do with him, and so on. Well, he actually comes to gain more power over the course of that bloody revolution, more power with the Spanish, because I think there's this racial hierarchy and they find him more civilized somehow, and that they think they can control him a little bit better than they can control this man Biassou. So I find a lot of tension among Biassou and Jean-Francois, with Toussaint hanging back, and later he'll come to the fore, and he's betrayed and killed. So my guys, Giorgio Sioux, ends up looking sort of retro, doesn't he? And I read this passage, I'm the counter-revolution. He writes these long letters about how he wept at the death of the king. He wept every day for the poor prince who was killed by the, the radicals in France, and he's offering his services to help, restore monarchy, which sounds weird. That sounds like you're supposed to be a leftist radical, but if you had lived under systems in which freedom was offered from the king's own law, and in which Catholicism offered you ways out, it's not surprising that there were many so-called popular royalists. And so now people are looking at the wars of independence in Latin America as well and finding this divide. Not everybody's for independence and republican government. What did we offer anybody of color? Nothing. So we made them 2/3 people. So you don't obviously often go for republics, but you might still go for monarchy if that's where your best benefits came from. Moreover, everybody coming from Congo, Angola is used to Congo Kings. And one of the other leaders, Makaya, has this very interesting passage. I'm the subject of 3 kings, the king of Congo, the king of France, and the king of Spain. And so monarchy is a system that Africans as well as some Europeans would rather have than some vague idea of a constitutional republic that may or may not even count them as human. So it's not surprising that he took that trend. But I do find, as I kept on looking for things, that he has actually gotten an idea about having a constitution. And he has connections with some of the priests in the area who will, he's illiterate. I was going to show you some of his documents are just signed with a stamp he had, because he had to have a French amanuensis, if that's how you pronounce it, to write these documents for him, and to also do it into Spanish, because he spoke French, not Spanish. So he's illiterate, but he's got big ideas about himself, as you could hear from that quote. And he has a number of these where he says, "The eyes of the universe are upon me." That was another one. And he really has a grand sense of himself and of his mission in life. Well, in 1793, you saw Marshall had the treaty that was signed between France and England, and Spain's also involved. They agree, in this earlier period, the Spanish had been sort of slipping them supplies across the border, and some of them had been buying illicitly. And as I said, slaves are running back and forth, so it's not a real firm frontier, we'll say. But in 1793, they're running out of supplies. He had an army of 40,000 people to supply. The plantations are ruined. There's no food. He's having to get stuff from the Spanish side. But he decides to make, Giorgio Sioux decides to make a formal treaty with the Spanish. And the Spanish king, Carlos IV, makes a brand new military organization for these people. He calls them the Black Auxiliaries of Charles IV. And so it's the only time this ever happens. There were always free black militias, as I've shown, but not this formal group with the name of the king and feted by the king. So the governors on the ground here and the military leaders may not really like these guys, may be scared of them actually, but they've got orders from the king, create this unit, and they all, Biassou and Toussaint LOuverture and Jean-Francois all get gold medals with the king's face on it, and 12 sub-chiefs get silver medals. And so I started tracking sub-chiefs as well too. So there are many of these wonderful people that we don't know anything about because they're lost to history. And Toussaint is a wonderful person, but he was not the only person who risked his life for many years to do this. So I always look for the ones that aren't so well known. And George happened to be one, but he was known by the Spanish and the French as the leader and was decorated, and Toussaint as well, and Jean-Francois, and 12 silver medals for the sub-chiefs, and below them, you know, hundreds and thousands with their women and children are all on these lists as well too. So for a while they get a little bit of help. There are some other bad incidents, a massacre of whites who had decided to come back, so the blood goes on, it's not settled, and in 1796, this peace treaty between Spain And France is going to say, well, we got to get these guys off the island, these black auxiliaries, if we're going to have peace. You know, they want to restore the plantation system, and they want these bad examples out. So they, but they're feted by the king, who's safely back in Madrid, while all the other governors and generals and so on in the islands are scared of these people. The king can be beneficent from afar. And so he's given them salaries, uniforms, military titles, gold medals, all kinds of ceremonies to decorate them, and so on. Now what do you do with them? Well, what they do with them is disperse them, another diaspora, as Marshall said, through the Americas. And so that's how I came to find one group of them in Florida that who knew, you know? And so I started working on them and came to find out that, you know, this man had a big picture of himself. Now he's up in the boondocks in St. Augustine where there's nothing. And he had been given a choice, either the Isle of Pines, which is on the southern coast of Cuba and is basically a prison, or St. Augustine. So he chose St. Augustine. And that's where he ends up. And from there, he writes all these letters about offering his services to go back and fight in France or to fight wherever in Europe. He wants also to go back to Saint-Domingue and rescue his mother that he wasn't able to get out. So I have a very interesting sort of picture of him as a person. And he still thinks he's grand. And he marches through St. Augustine with his uniform, his medals, his big pistols, and there are white planters there that are freaked out by Giorgio Sioux too, and they don't like it much, and they protest, but he's got the king's imprimatur, and he's going to be okay. So he ends up, they never let him go back to Europe, they never let him go back to get his mother, but he at least controls all of his troops in St. Augustine. His sisters came out with him, his wife and some others, and a group of maybe about 30 people. And he becomes the head of all the militias, the black militias in Florida, and they end up fighting Seminoles in the war that breaks out in 1800 and so on. So very interesting transfer of his military skills. And he dies suddenly in 1801 in St. Augustine, and I found all kinds of things about his burial and what he left. It was rapid death. He wasn't able to live a will and testament, but all of his things, including his big ivory pistols and his gold medal of the king and so on, were left at his death. And in St. Augustine, despite the protests and the fears about this example in St. Augustine, because of his connection to the king, they stage a very formal, amazing funeral service with a grand procession with the governor and all the military troops and so on, a big wake, and then the procession, and they bury him in the Tolomato Cemetery that you can see today. His grave is unmarked. I never could figure out where he was in there, but he's there. And they enter it all in the sacramental records, which I work on, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that at the end, maybe. And so we know about Giorgio Sioux, and he's recorded as the renowned black general and caudillo, which is like a leader on horseback. So they have to honor him, even though they sort of were disturbed by him, I guess. And that's only one of the stories that you can tell about some of the people that are dispersed, because Jean-Francois' group, all of them actually go to Cuba first, and the Cuban captain general says, no, you're not getting off the boat here in Havana. And so they have a big council of war right away about, no, 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 not here. And so they send them off in smaller groups elsewhere. They wanted to stay together. They knew that it was important for their power to stay together. But instead, they assign a lot of money to send them throughout the world. And my little gang comes to Florida. I have a grad student now who's Miriam Martin, who's of Guatemalan descent. She's tracking another big group that go to Trujillo in Honduras. And Jean-Francois ends up going back to Cadiz in Spain, the port in Spain. And nobody's researched that yet. I can't wait for somebody to do it, because imagine the leaders of the bloodiest revolution in all the Western Hemisphere rolling into town in Cadiz. I mean, it's okay if they're out there in the Caribbean, but you don't want them back in Europe. Well, they did get back to Europe, and as a grad student when I was first doing this, I was really just honed in on BSU, but I took a few extra notes about Jean-Francois while I was there, and I will try to get back to them. They accuse him of having gunpowder and weapons in his home. They arrest him at some point, and eventually I find him serving in Oran in North Africa for the Spanish military. So again, these are very mobile people with big ideas about themselves and about the possible rights they might be able to win. And so when George dies rapidly of some fever, we think, his brother-in-law, the brother of his wife, is that your brother-in-law? Yes. Ends up, Jorge Jacobo Georgiac ends up taking over, and he continues to run the black militias, where he ends up combining forces with another one of my Atlantic Creole rebels from the American Revolution, Prince Whitten, and their children marry. And I'm thinking, what are they talking about at night? The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and now they've married their 2 kids, and it's like, you know, and they end up fighting Indians together and doing all that before eventually the Americans will, you know, come in and acquire this colony of Florida, and they know they will never have the same racial situation if once the Americans come rolling in from Georgia and all those places. They'll want to put in that chattel system that the English had. And so when the Spanish evacuate to go to Cuba, all of these people go too. And so the story continues on in Havana and Matanzas, Cuba, where these dispersed groups, and where my Francisco Menendez went in the first evacuation when the British took over Florida. So this is the closest big Spanish colony. And it's not surprising that these waves of immigrants, Indians and Africans, who have a better deal under the Spanish system, will end up going there rather than staying under this English system of chattel slavery, which considers Indians, you should wipe them off the face or drive them west, and Africans, you should consider them 2/3 a person. So where would you go if you were? You'd get out of Dodge too. So they all end up going off to Cuba. And so anyway, I started looking, and everybody that looks at Saint-Domingue and the French Revolution, they do it through French records. Logical, right? So they get to go to wonderful places like Aix-en-Provence and do their research. But I remembered how permeable that border was from all that time, and how much intercourse there was with the Spanish during all that time. And I said, well, I'll look in the Spanish records instead for this. And I'm able to find stuff they never even knew about. And if I do say so myself, because the Spanish were like these ridiculously anal record keepers, and so you can find all kinds of stuff under the Spanish about these people in particular that they're worried about. There's a lot on that. So I will continue looking on that, but I did do Giorgio Sioux anyway. And when I started this as a grad student, you know, St. Augustine, for all the interesting history I talked about the religious sanctuary and, you know, all of that, in the 20th century, it was a pretty rough place on race, and the Klan was strong there, and lynchings, and you know, you may have read some of the stories about burning out whole black towns and so on. It was a heavy place to be. So when I first, as a graduate student, I was so excited about finding Giorgio Sioux. I gave this talk. And the next day, the newspaper in St. Augustine, the St. Augustine Record, had this horrible editorial thing about it. And everybody, of course, sent it to me because it was so ridiculous. But it was about, oh, you know, I was glorifying black murderers and killers of whites and, you know, condemning me. And this shows you how long ago, because they said I was just like Muammar Gaddafi. I thought, me? So from that rocky start with my history of Sioux, I am very gratified that if you go to St. Augustine today, you'll see big markers in his house where he was given a house by the Spanish government to live in. He got lands that were known as the Black General's Plantation, and so his history is finally getting recovered and recognized, and nobody from the Klan has spoken since about me being Muammar Gaddafi. so. Oh, his house. So if you go to, thank you, I forgot about that. If you go to St. Augustine today, you'll see where he held court up there, and you know, people coming to ask him for favors. He's the head of the gang, you know, so he had a lot of clout, and that's the home they gave him from St. Augustine. And then one of the rewards for military service is land. That's easy to give. You got a lot of land, and you just give it to them and give a land grant. So I found his land grants in the Spanish records and the state papers in in the American government too, because the American government comes in 1821 and they want to see what everybody owns, and many of my black claimants who had land get denied under the American government because they hadn't occupied it or improved it enough, or the titles were sketchy, whatever. But some of them do get to keep it, and I was on a panel at the Smithsonian one time, and this woman who was a dance anthropologist about Cuban rumba and everything, really interesting, said, "Do you know George J.F. Clark?" And I said, "Yes, I know. He's in my first book. He was an English surveyor who had a large African family, and his brother did too, and they're very powerful people, and he was a surveyor, and he made sure everybody got their lands, you know, titled, and they were militia captains as well. One of the women took her case all the way to the Supreme Court to keep her 400 acres and was denied because it was way over on Lake George and she really hadn't lived there or anything. But so the history goes on, and now it's recorded there, and if you go you can see it. And then just to remember Saint-Domingue, when you saw the earthquake, you saw how the presidential palace had tumbled. But that's what it used to look like, and right in front of it is a statue to honor the Maroons who ran away and who used to call on those conchs. Remember, I showed you one from Hispaniola, from hillside to communicate. So the story goes on as people start to retrieve some of these pieces from the Spanish records, and we'll have a bigger picture maybe then of all of this period when we get it done. But there's, I just brought some chunks of the best stuff, you know, but again, I do love the research, and we can do it. You have to, you know, dig it out, and you have to have some languages, and we're very lucky to work at Vanderbilt where I get research support to go on these trips and dredge it out, so I owe my thanks to them too. Yes, sir. Well, it was a term that are supposed to be, when the Spanish first come, they land in Hispaniola, and there were 5 chiefdoms there. One was supposedly friendly that helped them unload the wrecked ship, you know, before. And there's a lot of politics among those groups, and they always said, oh, those bad people over there are cannibals, and they're the Indians you don't want to deal with. And the word Carib comes from cannibal and cannibal. And it was a dichotomy, good Indian, bad Indian, that the Europeans set up at the beginning. And, you know, it's real interesting how the indigenous politics, how they use Europeans. The Europeans always think they're in control of everything, but those groups are also playing them one against the other and creating these fictions and getting them to do what they want, like hit those guys over there because they're cannibals. It is. It's the indigenous population, but the Taino Indians who were in Hispaniola made it seem as though they were cannibals, and they are a different group. They're all Arawak we think they're all Arawak descended, waves of people who came from South America northward, and then waves of different migrations, and they end up in different ones of the islands, and there's some kind of a split. And it was the Tainos who cast them as cannibals. And Columbus does talk about having seen, you know, and it was probably mortuary cannibalism like Beth Conklin talks about, some symbolic kind of cannibalism. It wasn't like everybody, and Marshall has it all over Brazil. No, Marshall doesn't eat chicken. Yes. Why don't you come up too, because you might.
The area that you described as the Paris of Haiti.
Yes. You know, I've never been there. Has anybody been to Le Cap? Cape Haitian, sometimes it's called. I would think that some of those huge structures have to still be there. I'd love to get there, actually, but the Jesuit convent was a whole block long. The cathedral was huge, a theater, all these stone buildings, and that was one of the markers of a civilized, prosperous place, was big worked stone and fountains and ports, and so I hope it's still looks something like that. I don't know. Yes, sir.
These leaders were dispersed. You mean exiled?
Yes.
They were normally told to get out, but they were given some sort of pension or something to live on?
Yes, they assign money from the budgets to give them for the moves. They just have to leave the island because that was part of the treaty between France and Spain, that they would leave. And they didn't get much say in it either. And so, but their best bet is to stay with Spain, so they go. And their salaries are guaranteed. So Sioux made 4,000 pesos a year, which was, the governor only made that. So that was another argument. And he came with his paper. And in the inventory of his goods left at his death, they say, and then there was this trunk with papers and it wasn't worth much. You know, I just wish we could find whatever that was. They saved the pistols and they saved the furniture and they saved the, but the papers, which were his paper trails, some he presented to them to get his payments and stuff. And it was, but what else was in there, I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
Doesn't she remind you of Gaddafi, right?
In his younger days, maybe.
Same winning smile.
I understand that France charged penalties or reparations on Haiti that they only finished repaying just before the big earthquake.
Yes. It was a terrible, I forgot, do you remember the exact amount? It was a terrible, terrible amount to finally get, and the idea was they were being compensated for the loss of this island and of their properties and their investments and so on. And they took the deal, but everybody else was isolating them too, so they were willing to get some kind of recognition. There's another wonderful dissertation that never got into a book, but we have it in our library by a wonderful fellow named Julius Scott. And he has subsequently done some work on that too, and it was a common wind, and that's the wind of revolution that's going through this world. And he did a part about how everybody started to talk about this revolution. And later he did a neat piece for us here, a talk for us here about how Toussaint, feared he was going to be isolated, and he knew he needed a navy. Because nobody would trade with them for a while. So they start grabbing boats and renaming them Fraternity, Égalité, and Libertad, and so on. And he's trying to grab sails. He knows he needs sails. He's trying to grab maps. He knows he needs some navigators and maps. And it was an interesting thing that here somebody who had never done anything like that was thinking, I've got to have a navy. And he has a little mini navy, at least for a little while, before he's developing that idea. But the isolation, the U.S. also isolates them, even though at the beginning they were a little bit sympathetic, is crucial because they have nothing with which to rebuild except this French loan, and they'll take it.
One more question. I think we're out of time.
Are we?
A little clarification. After the breakup of the military of Haiti, all these guys, you said they also sent troops to Africa?
I did. Yes, North Africa. It's not troops. So I don't know how many went, but Jean-Francois is there too. And the Spanish and Portuguese both had colonies in Africa. Yeah, but Spain kept their African colonies well into how long, Bill? Now? Okay. I don't go past the 18th century. So the northern coast of Africa, were always trying to hold on to, and Oran is where he ends up.
Spanish Rio,
And Spanish?
which is what Morocco invaded.
Mm-hmm.
The last colony.
Thank you. We'll see you one more week.
Okay.